When was the last time you went out for a meal or a coffee and you suddenly realized this place is too noisy? There's too much stimulus. And usually that stimulus is an inane, sweet, sugary type of pop music that's just spoiling the environment. Now, I used to work as a barista in a coffee shop, and let me tell you, if the music ever cut out in the middle of the day and all of a sudden the whole um, cafe was sort of plunged into silence, it was very awkward, very strange, and people were kind of noticeably bothered by it. And yeah, it did kind of kill the atmosphere. So we were kind of all aware that it was pretty important to have some kind of ambient vibe and atmosphere. Um, and the other side of that is true as well, which is I had a couple of colleagues who, for whichever reasons, they just decided to always play music at a volume that was too high, to the point of being grating. Now, I know people would say, well, that's a matter of personal opinion and that's just your taste and preference, but I don't think it is. I think there is a universal human sensibility to noise. And surely that's common sense. Surely everybody knows that um, excess sound, when it's unwanted, becomes noise, and your body or you have to work overtime to filter out that excess sound in a way that's chronically tiring. It's quite hard to put your finger on exactly kind of what it's doing to you, except for the fact that an experience that should be restorative, say having a coffee or buying some clothes or something with your family, or sitting outside somewhere, um, suddenly becomes tainted and spoiled when there's sugary noise. Now, I appreciate there's a balance here, as I said, in a coffee shop and a bar or a hotel. Yeah, fine. Um, but something I've noticed that personally I think is spiritually corrosive is when you go somewhere, usually to like an Asian country, where the landscape isn't enough. There has to be some kind of noise, and there has to be some kind of background filler, as if to say, there's never a point where someone can just be at ease with themselves, and with what remains of nature. And the only person really, well, there's two people that I've seen mention this. One is Sir Roger Scruton, and the other is His Eminence Cardinal Seurat, who's a very interesting figure in the Catholic Church. He is an African cardinal from, I think, Guinea in Central Africa. I think that's right. Who is very outspoken on the forces that are kind of affecting human dignity in the modern age. So his book is one of his books is called Silence, the Dictatorship of Noise. And that's a very powerful, compelling title. I haven't read the book, but I really think he's onto something with this. And sadly and very ironically, in one of the videos that I saw where Cardinal Seurat was talking about this topic, someone had kind of layered over the talk with precisely the very music that he was protesting the kind of evils of, and that might sound dramatic, but it is an evil in a way. The kind of inability of allowing people to ever relax without noise. And it's never been harder to have this happen in your day-to-day life, because the default is always for more. There's a very silly advert on the radio for some sort of broadband, and of course the selling point is that this broadband service has greater speed and bandwidth, and that means you can do more emailing, more apping, more emojiing, as if that's what people need in their life. Now, I'm not some reactionary individual that wants to reject all of technology. Here we are using technology. Otherwise, I'll just be sat in an empty studio talking to a wall. So, of course, there has to be a balanced view. And that clunking noise, by the way, was a light bulb. I've got some spare big light bulbs with nice filaments on the bottom of this trestle, and I keep kicking them off. So I'm just going to leave them on the floor for now. As I was saying, so the default setting of society is only leaning towards more and more noise. And even in your private life, just by definition, if you have a smartphone, which is basically everybody, there's a kind of temptation that emanates out of this phone to always be connected and doing something, to always have some background music on when you're cooking, when you're eating. I cringe when I'm sat eating a meal and I'm half watching a kind of Joe Rogan video or some sort of talk, as if I can't just spend 10 minutes focusing on food, that I've kind of worked quite hard to cook a nice meal, and to actually be able to sit with the full experience of sensation. Now, the short answer to all of this is just to stick your phone in a drawer. That's hardly news, but it's a lot easier to say than it is to do. One thing I try and do is have interesting books and even silly little projects to do things like drawing. Drawing out some kind of design, or just not really for a purpose of anything else, but just as a way to be doing something that's restorative instead of consumptive. And it's not easy. It's something that I think everybody will intrinsically struggle to do, and it's kind of it's a kind of ongoing campaign that you have to constantly be aware of. All of that is another great reason to be cultivating a practice of bushcraft and just returning to the outdoors. I know that lots of people will be making videos. I'll probably do some as well. But the important point is that you decide in advance, right, I'll do a few minutes of this, and that'll be switched off, and I won't be reliant on it or kind of drawn out in my attention to a phone or anything else, and I'll actually be allowed to fully relax. This is an idea that Seurat goes into, I think, much more detail on in his book, and it's this idea that we're never really relaxing. We're always just slightly humming along, just about consuming some kind of information. Anyone that's familiar with movement culture, which is a kind of emerging niche that has kind of thrown a hand grenade into what passes for the fitness industry, and it's spearheaded by this enigmatic Israeli chap, Ido Portal. His name is just made for it. So where was I going with this idea? I just lost my place because I was just thinking so much about Ido Portal. That guy's he's very contrarian, and he's produced a kind of practice of movement and physical culture that really is in a league of its own in its axiomatic ideas, as well as the resulting quality of the practice. Oh yeah, so we were talking about never actually being fully relaxed, and how that constant chronic availability of bandwidth and demands on your bandwidth, it isn't sustainable, and you can feel it in your body. You can feel this kind of tension that gradually crystallizes, and I'm I'm a big, I suppose you could call, disciple. So I'm a big believer of this criticism of the mind-body dualism. So this kind of philosophical problem or premise, which is that the mind exists separately to the body, and that all we are is a brain in a body. And Sam Harris is going to come along and tell us all about how wonderful that is, and how everything is an abstraction in the brain. And that, I think, the genesis of that idea originated in Descartes' work. So we have this kind of Cartesian undergirding of the modern world, which it kind of is the wrapper for or the delivery kind of carrier for a lot of issues that we have in modern working and modern living. So if it were true that we were just a mind in a body, it really wouldn't matter if our day-to-day life had a kind of sense of physicality and being embodied, or not, as it increasingly is. But we aren't a mind in a body. We're a embodied mind, and you know this because when you're stressed or when you're under too much pressure, you become tense, and our language is littered with all manner of phrasing that kind of shows the discovery of this embodied nature of what we are. And I often slip into this as well. We often sort of say, the mind and the body, because saying the mind, the body is kind of cringing and new age. So there needs to just be a more appropriate way to sort of talk about all of this stuff. So the central criticism of Descartes is, I have this problem where I say whilst, and I write it as well instead of saying while. So while it's true that the model of the mind and the body is useful for discovering knowledge, it's still just a model. So for example, for hundreds of years, And pretty much until the present day, surgeons have been very successful at undertaking life-saving surgery using a model that's very simplistic, kind of isolated analogy that, you could say, well, the bones are like some kind of scaffolding or foundations of a building, and arteries, well, we have arterial roads. So already the language is kind of showing that. Well, that's an opposite example, to be honest, where a dead physical system is using a live analogy, organic analogy. So arterial roads being one. But the point I've somewhat modelled now was we can go very far in imagining the world as a bunch of isolated components and systems, with one of the primary ones being the mind isolated from the body. And that's very useful for a operational, functional model of the world to give us useful knowledge. However, it is just a model. It's not actually the reality of how things are. And my gut feeling, that's a good one, gut feeling. My gut feeling on this is that a lot of the problems that we have, especially in Britain and just the West at large, things like obesity, depression, well, that's a controversial one, and kind of mass problems like that seem to be quite difficult for people to tackle. If you ever see a flowchart of all of the causes of obesity, they've basically just listed everything to a point where they may as well have listed nothing at all. And my feeling is that there's a deadening of the sensitivity to our nature as embodied beings. And it's very easy to go through life becoming more and more deadened to this embodied and tactile sensitivity. And this extends also to people that seem on the surface very physical. So even in the gym, if you do a lot of weight training, natural bodybuilding and so on, you can go very far and be very successful and seem to be very fit and athletically impressive. The same goes for CrossFit especially. They're probably the worst culprits. You can go very far in terms of your athletic prowess, but all the while you've deadened sensitivity to the more intangible virtues of real athleticism. And all you have to do to see that in action is to watch the finals of the CrossFit Games, where you supposedly got the most elite athletes on earth. But what you really have are people who are the most elite at deadening themselves to movement, to a kind of high resolution of movement quality. Now, maybe that's a little bit unfair, because I know for a fact that some of their coaches on the gymnastics side are all about that. Carl Paoli, for example, who preaches the doctrine of freestyle connection. And I say preaches the doctrine intentionally, because it's a positive doctrine of autonomy and human freedom, and those qualities that are hard to catch hold of. So things like grace, I suppose you could say things like agility, harmonious movements. So those are things that we sense much more clearly than we can describe. If you ever go to a gymnastics gym and watch a bunch of children training, you can very quickly see who has that harmonious quality and coordination to the movements in terms of the expression of skill, even if they're all doing the same skill. And even if the skill that they're doing is very simplistic, say a forward roll, you can just feel with this kind of kinetic empathy, you can kind of feel who there has this integral athletic quality that comes from a very high level of sensitivity to their own body and their body in space. And I really like these ideas to the point where, for a long time, I was just thinking about them in a lot of detail, and ended up producing a kind of 150-page philosophy about all of this stuff that I haven't really done anything with. And maybe at some stage I'll just try and do something with. To bring this all the way back to bushcraft, by definition, by being outside and by being observant, when we're naturally tapping into that sensitivity. And I think if you're someone who is a thinker and very analytical, or maybe even quite political and kind of attached to some kind of ideology in politics, or quite a rigid position. I've got pretty strong views on a lot of topics, all of which are far outside the Overton window. Something like bushcraft, it takes the sharp corners off those edges, and it's there to provide you with this kind of reciprocal restoration. So you look after nature, and nature looks after you.